Professor Munoz, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so honored to have you with us here today and excited to hear from you on your thoughts on religious freedom and what the separation of church and state really means.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure for me to be with you today.
Ask if you would like to make some opening comments, and then we'll go to questions.
Sure. Well, let me first again just say thank you for having me, and welcome to all those who are watching. Thank you to the Zimmermans and to Mrs. Turner. I know she has been very involved in civic education, and my whole life has been devoted to studying and understanding the American Constitution. Thomas Jefferson said, we can't defend our rights if we don't understand them. And so podcasts like this and programs such that you're supporting are so important to our constitutional democracy. So it's just a real pleasure. I just want to say thank you for all the work you do, and thank you for everyone else for listening. It's important work we're doing here. So I was asked to talk about the separation of church and state. Maybe I say just a few words about why we have the separation of church and state and some contemporary disputes about it. I should say, like everything involving the First Amendment, there are two sides, or at least two sides. People disagree about these things. I certainly have my opinions, but it's not like there's one obviously clear right answer and one obviously clear wrong answer. Different groups of people interpret the First Amendment differently, and I think our task is to try to understand those differences and think through them as best we can. So let me start with maybe what I'll call the progressive or more liberal view of separation of church and state. I start with that. That's because it was very influential in the early Supreme Court decisions. It started in the mid 20th century, and you can see this approach today in Justice Sotomayor's jurisprudence today on the court. The progressive view says, look, we need to separate church and state because religion in human history has been a divisive force in society. It's very hard for people of different religious beliefs to agree on, what is truth or what is the true religion. As we know from the experience in old war Europe, the wars of religion were a product of theological disputes. And America was created not to have those theological disputes. And so if we can keep religion and religious disputes out of our political life, that will lead to more harmony and peace. Now, that's a real simplification, of course, but that's sort of the basic approach. Religion is prone to divisiveness and division, political division, and the way we prohibit that division from interfering or infecting our politics is to keep religion out of the political sphere. The more what I could just call the more traditional approach, I think this was probably the primary approach of the founders, maybe more of conservatives today, is to say, well, we separate church from state because the role of government itself is limited. We, the people, create the government to protect our rights, and we need the government to help secure our life, liberty, and property. But we don't rely on the government to secure religious truth. We limit the government because there's higher authorities than the government, namely church authorities are higher than the government. Church authority comes directly from God, but political authority comes from we, the people. We, the people, don't ask the government to direct our religious exercises. In fact, we have an obligation to God to direct our religious obligations according to our convictions and conscience. So we limit the state in light of the higher authority of the church and of our higher duties to God. So you could say both liberals and the traditional approach, they both separate church from state, but they do so for different reasons. Those on the left worrying about the division religion might cause in political society. Those on the more traditional approach saying, no, we limit the state's authority because of the more sovereign or higher duties we have to our Creator. Sometimes those overlap, but sometimes those different approaches lead to different results. So let me give you a concrete example. Maybe what I said is a little bit abstract, but take the issue of should taxpayer dollars or should government be funds support religious schools? Traditionally, this had to do a lot in American history, had to do with Catholic schools, but let's just say private religious schools. Can a charter school, which is a public school of sort, can they get taxpayer dollars, or can a religious school, a private religious school, get a government grant to teach STEM or math or sciences, something like that? The liberal approach would say, no, we have to separate church from state, and therefore we need to keep government money from funding private religious schools. We have to exclude religion from the public square. The more traditional approach would be to say, well, we do limit government's ability to tell people how to worship. You can't make anyone go to a religious school. But if the religious school needs help teaching math or science or other subjects that are taught in the public schools, then yeah, there are civic reasons why, private religious schools teach American citizens too, and they can participate on equal terms with non-religious citizens. So these differences on why we separate church from state can lead to real practical differences on how we interpret the First Amendment and the role of religion in the public square. Okay, I've said a lot, and that's pretty high level of abstraction. So maybe I can turn it over and I can get some questions, and that will help clarify what I just outlined.
Well, that's great. And Janine, we'll go to you first.
Great, thank you. I've been traveling, so I'm sorry I'm not on camera today. Forgive me for that. But terrific overview, and I had a thought that just popped into my mind when you were talking about, the religious schools, and should taxpayer money fund, say, a Catholic school or a Muslim school or things of that nature. And then my first thought was like, well, as long as the government's funding all different kinds of religions, if they just funded one type of religion, that would be not freedom of religion. It would have to be, with all religions. So I was thinking about that. And I thought, wait a minute, it's kind of interesting. The shift of education and even college campuses that, when there was this shift from a lot of the colleges being faith-based, and a lot of the schools always had faith within the schools, that shift happened for some of these good reasons, so they could be open to all religions. So that kind of goes without saying with this in regard to what I'm now thinking about outside the box a little bit here. It wasn't for money. We're talking about that religious schools want funding, and they can't get funding because they're a religious school, a private religious school, and they're denied the funding. Or even if it was a religious charter school, funding, it's a big question right now. Well, did a lot of these schools was it on principle really, or was it just that they wouldn't get any money? If we have God in our school, we can't get money. If we have God in our college, we don't get the money. Because even it's an interesting thought too. Even private colleges get taxpayer funded money. All these colleges, there are grants given to them from the government, things of that nature. So it's interesting to think about how finances and that all powerful God of money influence the decisions in education. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, you bring up two different themes related for sure. The first is on equality, and we could say there's two types of equality. The first, as you mentioned, is well, if government taxpayer dollars do go towards churches, certainly they can't go to only one church, and I think almost everyone agrees to that. Government can't say this is the right religion and only fund one sect or one religion. It would seem that the most reasonable proposition is if government is funding, let's say, math instruction in private schools, including religious schools, the real question for the government is, well, is this school teaching mathematics well. And if you are teaching mathematics well, presumably you should be eligible for the funding. And if you're not, maybe you're not eligible for the funding. But the religious character of the school, it would seem, shouldn't really matter, right? You're not funding the school because it's religious. You're funding the school because there's a civic interest in young people learning math, whether it's at a religious school or a traditional public school. So I think that your first concern about equality is certainly well taken. Religion should be able to participate on equal terms with other religious groups. There's also the question of equality between religious and non-religious groups. And in here, the religious groups would say, look, we shouldn't be excluded just because we're religious. There's a case, this is from 2017, and it was a very interesting set of facts. It was a scrap tire environmental program in the state of Missouri. So, you know that black playground surface that's soft and rubbery that are the playgrounds, right? So if a kid falls, it's not hard concrete, but those are actually created. That soft playground surface is created from used tires. You can't burn tires, and they're environmentally hazardous. So they figured out a way we can grind the tires up, and it's environmentally sensitive, and we make playground ground out of those tires. And so a Christian school in Missouri applied to be a part of this program. Now, the end of the program is public safety, and you got a government grant to resurface your playground. And the question before the Supreme Court was, is the Lutheran school in this case, if they get a government grant to use these tires for their playground, does that violate the separation of church and state? And some justices said, well, because they're religious, they can't participate. Now, the religious school said, well, shouldn't we be treated equally with other groups, religious and non-religious groups? And you qualified for the program based on, your needs. Did you have a playground that needed resurfacing? Did you lack the resources to do it yourself? And they said, don't discriminate against us because we're religious. So there's two types of equality here. There's the equality among religions and also the equality of religious groups with non-religious groups. And both those are central to especially the traditional understanding. Now, the other thing, very briefly, you mentioned about government funding, and look, funding usually comes with strings attached. And so even if a religious school, private religious school, is eligible for government funding, it may be that they don't want to take it because whoever pays the funds is likely going to want to have a say on who you hire and what things you teach, and it may be that a private group says, look, actually we'd rather not have the funds to retain our own institutional autonomy. Now that's more of a prudential question. It's not really necessarily a legal question, but it's a question that every group that receives government funds has to consider for itself. I mean, if you receive government funds, take this podcast itself. If you got a grant from the government might ask something of you, and maybe you don't want to be involved with having to comply with all these governmental regulations. And one way to stay free of those regulations is to not take the government funds.
Interesting. I'm thinking about it from the different levels of school. You have elementary, middle, high school, college, right? And then I was thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if nobody took any money from the federal government? I'm talking about that more like the federal government than the local.
Mm-hmm.
If no one took any money from the federal government, how different would it be? And I think that's true with the big government in general. Businesses take money from the government. Everyone becomes kind of beholden to Uncle Sam because they're getting the money. And I don't know that our founders really pictured it that way. But big business, I think, we didn't really start sort of with the railroads, right? I mean, they started just the businesses started merging with getting government money. And it's not that it's an all bad thing, but it just seems like people lose their sense of self when they become so desperate for funding. And did our founders really intend it to be that way? I mean, the taxpayer money that's coming from the local communities to pay for the local schools, and then the local parents and everybody gets to have their say. It just seems a little bit different from the federal government piping in. And of course, now there's a whole debate about whether the federal government should be giving money to schools in the first place. But it's really most fascinating if you think about colleges. What if colleges removed themselves altogether from this money? What would they really do?
Your insight or your intuition is exactly right. At the time of the founding, the founders disagreed in some ways, on the exact proper relationship between church and state, but they all agreed, let's keep these questions at the local level, at the state level. Same for education as well. And the basic insight there is, look, I'm from the state of Washington, originally from the city of Seattle. And the basic idea was, of course, Washington is not part of the Union in 1787, but let's let the people of every state control their own educational system. You get a lot of experimentation, but that's what self-government is, really, right? And so who's going to hold schools accountable? Well, the local community, parents and teachers. And if you don't like the way a state is spending its money, you can move to another state. So most of these questions, especially with taxpayer dollars, not for things like national defense and things like that, but were local questions. And it's really connected to the idea of self-government, that it's much easier to govern yourself at the local level. I mean, to think for the students out there, just think if you wanted to meet a member of your city council, you could probably just write to them. Maybe your parents know someone who knows someone. You could probably get a meeting with a member of your city councilman. That's probably not that hard. But to be able to know your senator, or to have a face-to-face meeting with your member of Congress, the House of Representatives, that's a lot harder. Now, of course, there's some aspects of local government, especially at the time of the founding, that didn't work very well. But the general understanding was if we can keep questions closer to home, they'll be resolved better in that way.
Federalism. I love federal.
That's exactly what
I love federalism.
And federalism got a bad name because of race relations for good reasons. And it was tragic as applied to race. But not applied to race, I think we're starting to recover some of the reasons why we instituted federalism at the very beginning.
Right. I mean, there were reasons why that was important, of course. But I mean, we've lost touch with the local community. And in closing, I need to toss, but it's just interesting to think about the ingenuity or the American genius, the ability to think freely and to create maybe new ways to teach schools, or new types of topics, whatever people might want to do. That's just, I think this is true in life in general, in every aspect of life. When you start becoming so dependent upon an income, Big Daddy giving you money, or Big Mama giving you money, whatever it may be, you are the government. I'm talking about Uncle Sam, so to speak. You become stifled. Yeah. And it's not that you don't need the money, and it's not that their areas don't need the money. I'm not saying that, but I just think it's an interesting thought. Where would we all be? And I'm not talking about the local taxpayer money in the area. I'm talking about a grander scheme, but it stifles ingenuity, wouldn't you say, a little bit? And then I'm going to toss
it. It certainly can, and it certainly stifles accountability and responsibility as well.
Yeah. The classroom becomes more homogenized instead of individualized to maybe what the community really needs and how you could reach those students in that way. Okay, thank you. Fascinating conversation. I'm going to toss to Jewel.
Thank you. This is Jewel Gilbert with Constitutional Chats, and this has been fascinating so far. It's a topic I care a lot about. So I want to ask a pretty big question. I've always, when we talk about separation of church and state, it has come up on the show before, and we've talked about how it's not technically in the Constitution, and it comes from the term. First time we can find it is in a letter like from Thomas Jefferson, but that the founders did, argue about the role of the church and the state. also at the time of the, I believe at the time of the ratification of the Constitution, that there were established state religions by state, but the federal government could not, well, the national government could not have a national religion, but that the states did have different levels of state religions, which was a problem for me as a Catholic, of course, because we only had Maryland, I think, where we were okay. But so, but now today, with the way we understand it, here's what my question is: legally, what legal constitutional understanding did we adopt that made us believe as a country that we could legally treat secularism as not a religion, but we could treat Christianity as a religion?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And this is why I go back to as I started, like, there are different understandings of why we have the separation of church and state. And these different understandings are apart from different, result in part from different interpretations of our founding fathers. You're right that the phrase separation of church and state does not appear in the Constitution. The Constitution or the First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So there's language about religious establishments, and Congress also can't prohibit the free exercise of religion. And it is true, at the time of the founding, some states did have religious establishments. The 1778 Constitution of South Carolina said the Protestant Christian religion is the official religion of the state. South Carolina was the only state that made it so clear, but other states had at least elements of one might call an establishment. What did that mean in practice? It meant state law mandated how ministers were selected, right? So, and in an old style establishment, ministers were paid for by the state, kind of like the public schools today. Like, who owns the public school buildings? Well, the state does. Who employs the public school teachers? Well, the state does. They're state employees. The older understanding of an established religion was, well, the ministers, your preachers, are selected by the state and paid by the state. Now, in South Carolina, what they said is, well, this is how you must elect your ministers. And that's what we moved away from, right? And the reason we did that, we moved away from that, is it's not the role of government to say who can be. You said you're Catholic. Who's the local Catholic bishop? What state are you in?
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania. So
yes,
the governor of Pennsylvania shouldn't have any say on who the Archbishop of Philadelphia is, right? Just to use the Catholic tradition. That's really what the separation of church and state means most clearly. It's really about the church being able to govern itself.
That's so fascinating. Did not know that the establishment of a religion went that in South Carolina, that it dictated how ministers were selected, elected. It's fascinating.
Let me connect it to something Mrs. Turner said too. And it's a little bit complicated because the way that not only did the state of South Carolina say this is how you must select your ministers, state of South Carolina also said, and this is the amount of money you can raise every year. That is, state officials could limit the amount of money a church could raise.
Wow.
They also granted special privileges to establish churches. Like, only if you're part of the church establishment could you be incorporated, meaning the church could own property. So there are real benefits. So church-state relations, establishments traditionally were a relationship of privilege and control. The state gave the established churches special privileges, and they exerted special controls. And what the founders were trying to do was to say, no, actually, certain religions shouldn't have special privileges, and the state shouldn't exert certain controls. We separate church from state to protect churches and also to set them free from political influence. And the most obvious example of this is the selection of church officials, of bishops. in the Catholic tradition. By the way, this is going on in China right now, right? I mean, a big issue in the Catholic Church is, the Chinese communist officials want to have a say on who the bishops are, Catholic bishops are in China. Like this is not just an issue from the past, I mean, this right now going on in China, right? So that's, I mean, this gets.
Yes,
sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating. And it's amazing how the founders tried to solve the puzzle. But from what I'm hearing from what you've taught us so far is that, and we kind of understood the constitutional mindset, but you've given real concrete example of the state in the founder's view is not, and that's a slightly different understanding of what it feels like now. The understanding is of separation of church and state is more so that the government has decided that secularism is true, and you can believe what you want, but the government will not give any, but the government's religion is secularism.
Yeah,
And
so you're going in and out there, but I got the gist of your question, and I think what you see here is a byproduct. If we say, as I said, the sort of progressive approach is government can't fund religion, and religion must be excluded from the public square. When the public square expands, that means implicitly that religion must recede. Right. So can you have around Christmas time, can you have religious displays, on government property and things like that? I mean, the more places where government is, if you really believe in this hardcore notion of separation of church and state, then wherever government is, religion must recede. And that feels like the establishment of secularism. Right. I mean, this is what you're getting at. And that's not an unrealistic or untrue reaction, right?
And Mike, what I wonder,
being treated, shouldn't religious groups be treated just on equal grounds, not disfavored or discriminated against?
and I don't know if there's is there a legal solution to that? The grounds for truth or the grounds for knowledge, those things are very hard to establish on a secular grounds, and it really comes to some sort of belief system. At the end of the day, science can't reason itself, and that being known in our founders in general, assenting to natural law and being comfortable with, being very comfortable in appealing to natural law in our founding documents as a whole. Is it even possible to lose that and still have something binding your society except for something else, some other religion like secularism, which again is just still not telling us anything about what truths the government is founding its laws on?
Yeah, Jefferson talked about this when talking about human equality and rights, our natural rights. And he said, our rights are going to be, this is in Notes of the State of Virginia, his book. He says, the surest foundation of rights and the security of rights is the belief in the minds of the people that they're gifts from their creator, right? And Declaration of Independence says we're endowed by our creator. That's not to say that there aren't other ways of understanding human equality and rights, but Jefferson said, surely this is the surest way. If I believe you are a child of God, whatever your difference is, whatever our difference is, if you're a child of the Creator, you have a dignity that I must treat you with respect. I mean, sometimes we forget how powerful the idea a universal God who is the God of everyone. It means even when we're at war, we treat our enemies. We don't kill them. We detain them. And then when the war's over, we set them free. We don't execute, if we win a war, we don't execute the men and enslave women and children as they did in the ancient world. And that's because the idea that no, there's a real human dignity, whatever differences we might have, real human dignity, and we must treat everyone, even people we're at war with respect because of our respect for human rights of everyone. And I think there are some real Judeo-Christian roots to those sentiments. Again, not that you can't have other philosophical reasons, but undoubtedly the Judeo-Christian roots of human dignity are very have been very powerful in America and Western civilization more generally.
Thanks so much. Taught me a lot in 10 minutes. I'll pass it to Wyatt.
Oh, thank you, Jewel. This is Wyatt Hensley here, and what a fascinating and interesting discussion. I really liked your point that about whenever church and state was first envisioned, that wall, it was more meant to protect church from the state rather than keep the church out of the state. I just found that really interesting. And I remember learning about it too a while back ago. And I think that's a common misconception that a lot of people have nowadays. My first question is, how has the increase of religious diversity within the United States impacted the role of church and state?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. All these questions have been great. That's a great question. Well, I think it's a little bit of a misconception that we didn't have a lot of religious diversity early in America. Let me give you a concrete example. At the time of the founding, in many of the states, I can't remember in Pennsylvania. Where are you, Wyatt? What state are you in?
I'm from Missouri.
You're from Missouri. Okay, well, Missouri wasn't part of the Union then. But like
It was not.
in
Well,
Massachusetts, I used to live in Boston.
Mhm.
In the 1780 Constitution of Massachusetts, to be governor or to be a state senator, you had to be a Protestant. So if you're Catholic or Jew or just not a Protestant, you couldn't be governor of the state. And that was pretty common at the time of the founding. Many states had religious tests for office, or they had oaths, like the governor's oath or the state senator's oath, had a religious content. For example, in many states, I think Delaware and other states, if you were elected governor, you had to, in your oath of office, you had to declare your belief in the Old and New Testament. So Jews could not be governor. In our federal constitution, in the national constitution, there's a provision that says no religious test for office. And that was criticized by some people. And they said, look, this means, they said Catholics and Mohammedans, Muslims, but they used the phrase Mohammedans. Catholics and Muslims might become president. They might become a member of Congress. And James Madison said, if their fellow citizens vote for them, then that's fine. We shouldn't have religious tests for office. And I think that, to my mind, that's the best of the American tradition, right? And I think with our increasing religious diversity, though we had real religious diversity back then, we've kept those founding principles have helped us navigate religious diversity, where you're an equal citizen, whatever your religious beliefs, or even if you don't have religious beliefs, you can be an American. And that's been a great strength of America, right? It's not exactly that our diversity is our strength. We say that all the time. It's actually our unity and our principles of religious freedom, of respecting other people, seeing each other as equal citizens, whatever our religious differences. That's our real strength, right? The unity and our commitment to our founding principles.
Absolutely. Fantastic point. My next question is talking about the discussion of the motto, "In God We Trust." Now, especially in recent years, we've seen some people wanting to get rid of this motto or, just maybe changing it. Where do you see this debate going in recent or in the coming years?
Well, it's interesting. When a while back, there was a lawsuit about to get the phrase "under God" out of the Pledge of Allegiance,
Mm-hmm.
right? And anyway, most people didn't know this history. The phrase "under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954, and this
Mm-hmm.
was in the context of the Cold War and the desire of political leaders at the time to distinguish God-fearing America from atheistic Soviet Union. I think actually where the current law is right. And the current law says, no, the people want under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. That's fine. For the same reasons Jewel and I were talking about a few minutes ago, that many believe, and certainly some of the founders believe, our rights are endowed by our Creator. And to say that we're under God means that there's an authority above or beyond the people. The people can't do anything. The people can't take away natural rights. That would be wrong for the people to do, even if it was popular. So under God is a way of communicating. There are even limits to what the people themselves to do, that the people are subject to a higher law of right and wrong. Jewel mentioned the natural law. This is the natural law tradition. At the same time, I think it's right to say you can't you can't punish a student for failing to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. There's been some religious objections to the Pledge of Allegiance. Jehovah Witnesses I think it's actually a violation of the Ten Commandments to pledge allegiance. It's actually two things: the pledge allegiance and to salute the flag. Those are actually two distinct acts. And so there's been religious objection, and I think it's right to say, well, actually, your freedom of speech is also a freedom not to speak. So, well, the recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance is certainly fine, including with the phrase "under God." If a student says, "Look, I can't do this for reasons of conscience," I think you can't make them say that. And they can respectfully stand or be non-disruptive. But so I actually think we ended up in the right place in our law.
That is a fantastic point too about the acknowledgement of, under God is acknowledging some of the limits of our own powers as human, as government. I hadn't really thought about that. So thank you for that. And
Well,
then
the classic example of this in American history is really the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The debate between Lincoln and Douglas was it involved slavery in the federal territories, and it was Stephen Douglas. This is not Frederick Douglass. Stephen Douglas said, "Look, is the African American a person who has rights, or can they be treated like an animal and enslaved?" And Stephen Douglas's position was, let the people decide. If the people of a state or a territory want slavery, if they want to define a human being as only a white person, then the people of that state can do so. He's the first, sort of pro-choice politician. That is, the people, there's nothing the people can't do. And Abraham Lincoln said, no, no, no. The people don't decide who is or who is not a person. That's established by nature and nature's God. The people don't have the right, the moral right to say you, an African American, are not a man. That's a violation of natural justice. And Lincoln said, that's despotism. So that's what we mean by that even the people themselves are subject to a higher law. That is the core issue of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And under God, in the highest way, recognizes that Lincoln was right and Stephen Douglas was wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. What a great way to include a bit of history too in there. So my final question is concerning a current Supreme Court case regarding Oklahoma, the state, a neighboring state of mine, establishing the first religious charter school. And I know there's been a lot of debates, and like I said, right now the Supreme Court's currently discussing it. I was wondering if you would give your insight on the case, what it's about, and maybe how the Supreme Court might go.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm an expert in predicting what the Supreme Court has done in the past, not in the present. So I don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do. But
Well,
it gets back to the earliest conversation we had, how I started. Like, if you believe, so the basic facts of the case is there's this basically a Catholic school that's a charter school. And then the question is, charter schools get money from the government. Can the government fund a Catholic school? And if you have this older understanding of separation, or what I call the progressive understanding of separation, which is that religion should be excluded because religion is divisive and we can't let taxpayer funds go to religion, you're going to say no, a Catholic school can't get government funds. The other side says, look, if you have a program of funding charter schools, you can't say anyone and everyone can start a charter school except the religious group. Don't religious groups get to be treated as on equal terms as other groups? My sense from recent cases is that the Supreme Court is likely to hold it constitutional. But there's one of the justices, Justice Barrett, recused herself, so there's only 8 justices. Maybe we get a 4-4 tie. In that case, at the lower level, the lower courts found that the school was unconstitutional, funding the school was unconstitutional. A little bit hard to know. I think John Roberts is the key vote here, and he's a little bit hard to predict. So it's
Just to
unclear how this is going to turn out. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to clarify, so if it does end in a 4-4 vote, what would happen?
It's going to go, it will be found, the lower court ruling, in this case, I believe it's the Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Supreme Court. They found that the school violated the Constitution. And so if it's a 4-4 tie at the Supreme Court, you go to the lower court. If it's a 4-4 tie, I expect we'll have another case with similar facts get to the Supreme Court sooner or later.
Yeah.
This issue is going to go on and on. It's
Absolutely. Well, this is just fascinating discussion, and thank you for answering all the questions, and I will pass it back over to Kathy.
Well, thank you, Wyatt, and thank you, Professor Munoz and Jewel and Janine. It's been a great discussion so far. And we want to take a minute before we go to the audience questions to recognize our schools and teachers and students that are watching today. And we have students who are watching from the Emerald Coast Christian Academy with D'Angela Hines. We have students watching from the Santiago Villegas Leadership School in Arizona. And we have William Brown from Cherry Hill Christian School watching with students today. So if you're a teacher watching with students and we didn't give you a shout out just now, drop it into the Q&A and we'll be glad to recognize you before the program's over. We also want to thank our listeners from Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. KKVV airs Constituting America's Constitutional Chats Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to all of our listeners in Las Vegas. I want to start with Robert Zimmerman, who again is our sponsor of today's chat. And thank you, Robert. Robert had a couple of comments. First of all, he said, as to Janine's comment, President John Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. This seems somehow a quaint and outdated comment nowadays. But thank you, Robert, for that observation. But then Robert also had one other observation here, and part ways of a question. Protection of church from state. To have this be our common understanding, this then destroys any argument on this subject. Thank you, Dr. Munoz, and please keep voicing this constitutional understanding across America, especially to our youth. And I think that's something that you've taught us today, Professor Munoz. It's really resonated with all of us, is protection of church from state.
Well, I'm so glad that Mr. Zimmerman could join us, and I'm so glad he connected us together. I might just say on the Kennedy quote, maybe the message for today is, ask what you can do for your fellow citizen. I think of an entrepreneur, these young guys asking these great questions, to go start a business and provide employment, for families, so people can go to work and support their families. That's a great thing to do for the country, but just for your neighbors, right? Creating real opportunity for meaningful work. People can live their vocation. So, maybe our current moment is, ask what you can do using your God-given talents to serve your other man and provide for your own family. America's really built on small business, and sometimes small businesses and entrepreneurs don't get the credit they're doing for the real ways they serve the common good.
Very true. And thank you for all that you do through all your service, both at Notre Dame and at the University of Texas at Austin, their Civics Institute. Now, Terrence Durbin asks, why did Justice Barrett recuse herself from the case? Do you happen to know? Was she?
I don't think I know her, but I don't think we actually know. I don't think she's said it public, or maybe I should just say, I don't really know. So I just don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure she took it very seriously, and maybe she has a personal connection to one of the litigants somehow, but I'm just not sure.
And then Rick Maryberry says Dr. Munoz presents invaluable information in an inspirational manner. The Constituting America team asked great questions, and the recording should be shown to every history and civics class. So thank you for that. Rick also has a question. He says, insightful presentation. In the 60s and 70s, when I was in school in Massachusetts, we would have classroom and all classroom assemblies open with a prayer. To open the Veterans Day Assembly, a prayer would be given. The first day of school assembly would open with a prayer for a blessing for a good year. That's not allowed in the schools here today. What are your thoughts on that? And could those activities be put back without challenging the Constitution? And Rick believes that communities should have the ability to put those back.
Yeah, well, thanks for the kind comments. And let me just also say the student questions were phenomenal, really, really good from the two young fellows. So I was really impressed. I am really impressed. On the question on prayer in public schools, so in 1962 or 1963, I can't quite remember the year, there was a Supreme Court case that it was actually two cases in the early 60s. The first said no more Bible reading. It was a practice in many public schools, including one in Pennsylvania. The school day would start. I mean, the young people won't remember this, but they used to have the intercom, and you go to the principal's office, and you could speak over the intercom. It's probably totally meaningless to anyone younger than me. And in many schools, they'd start the day with readings from the Gospels or the Old Testament or the Psalms. That was declared unconstitutional. And also in some places, including the questioner's public schools in Massachusetts, it sounded like the school day or the school year began with a prayer. And these were usually non-sectarian prayers. The Supreme Court said those were unconstitutional. Now I have kind of quirky views on this. I think those are still unconstitutional. I don't think the Supreme Court would allow them today. Now, prayers among adults in like a city council meeting or that you could probably do, but not in the context of a public school, especially an elementary school. I don't think there's an appetite to revisit those. Now, I think now my position is a little bit odd here. I actually think it's not proper for the public schools to compose prayers for students to say. But it's not because of the separation of church and state. It's actually because that authority, in my view, was not given to the government. And the public schools are governmental authorities, state actors. We don't give the government authority to write prayers for our children. Now, of course, if they want to voluntarily pray, that's fine. And I certainly would be supportive of robust ways for children to get religious instruction through churches independently, even in the public school classrooms or things like that, before the school day or after the school day. So there can be some ways to facilitate the moral and religious development of school children in a cooperative ways. But the actual idea of school officials writing prayers, and that's what happened in the case. It just strikes me that we, the people, actually don't give authority to the principal or the school board to write prayers for our children. That's just not a power we gave to government. And it's a power reserved for churches and parents. So I actually think the no prayer in public school, there are good constitutional reasons to support those decisions. Now, that's a different reason than the Supreme Court gave. But I will say many people disagree with me. It's a close call. So my views are a little bit quirky here, but one can have good arguments on both sides.
Well, thank you for that. And Stephen Murray has an interesting observation. He says, in the First Amendment, shouldn't understanding it be in part on the amendment using establishment, which is a noun, rather than the verb establish, as most people discuss it? This would then speak to government non-interference with churches, correct?
Well, my rules of grammar were really poor. I was really always bad in language arts, as we used to call it, So, but I think the spirit of the question is correct. And it gets to the question, and really the question you have to answer is, what is an establishment of religion? And I think the historically accurate answer is that an establishment of religion was a certain type of relationship between church authorities and political authorities. As I said earlier, a relationship of privileges, that is, the government gives certain churches privileges, and controls. The government imposes controls, like who can be a minister or how you select your ministers. In South Carolina, this might be to go back to the conversation I had with Jewel earlier, there was an oath of office that in the state constitution that ministers had to take. So these are state officials telling ministers the oath that they had to take. So I just think this type of relationship where the state is exerting control and therefore also exerting privileges, like that's what we want to end to for the underlying purpose of freeing churches from state control. I mean, that's the real animating purpose, because churches have their authority from God, not from the state.
Well, thank you for that. And I want to, in the last few minutes we have here, I want to bring Janine back because I think Janine, I know Janine has had an idea that she's voiced in the past on prayer in school. And Janine, love to have your comments on that.
Oh, thanks, Kathy. I was just going to build upon the conversation here a little bit about not saying a prayer shouldn't be written for students to say. And, I agree with that. I remember in elementary school in Euless, Texas, and we would pray in the morning. And I remember one student stood up to leave the room, and I had I was just, I don't know, second, third, I had such empathy for that child. It just seemed awkward and isolatory. And I don't know how one prayer could really, cover all religions. On the flip side of that, though, is I hate to see there not be any sort of recognition of a higher power. And of course, creators in our founding documents. And my idea has always been, and I've spoken about this on the show before, but never in this particular context, but is that you have a time of 10, 15 minutes of reflection, and you have different rooms, and the student can go to whatever room their religion is. No religion, just wants to meditate, do some yoga, they Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, whatever they may be, they can just go to their own room and have some time to reflect or to integrate that with, public service, civic duty, character. I think that would kind of be an interesting way. So it's not excluded where students grow up thinking about something besides, themselves, which is rather important. I also have an answer for the Coney Barrett. I looked it up. It's pretty much what you said. This recusal was filed with speculation that her friendship with a Notre Dame law professor, Nicole Garnett, who is affiliated with the school, might be a factor. While justices are not required to explain their reasons for recusal, Garnett has been a prominent voice in arguing for public funding religious charter schools, and she worked with the Notre Dame Law School. So it looks like Justice Barrett and Garnett have been close friends since they clerked together. So that may be a little insight. She obviously,
could be, yeah. There's been no publicly stated reason. So
yes, and I'm concurring with that. Yeah, I'm concurring. I was just giving a little extra dollars as I just learned from AI.
I will say, there's a tradition on many colleges campuses where, like at University of Texas, for example, right around the university, there's the Catholic chaplaincy, the Baptist chaplaincy. There's churches all around, right there. I mean, you wouldn't even know if they're on campus or not because you're right. I'm sure technically they're off campus, but that's been a way a sort of healthy separation but cooperation. And the idea is, look, kids move away from home, they go to college, but we want them, even though it's not the job of the University of Texas, to hire a Catholic priest and to pay the priest and to hold religious services. That's not the university's job. At the same time, they want to do everything possible so Jewel, when he goes off to the University of Texas, can go to Mass and get the religious instruction. And that sort of framework of respecting boundaries and differences, at the same time facilitating the moral formation, religious formation of young people, I think that is the healthy middle ground that almost all Americans really agree to. and that we move to the excesses when we ban religion from the schools, and we also move to the excesses when we try to do religion through the schools. So there is a place for the distinction or separation for church and state, but it should be one that's respectful and helpful to religious authorities. Not
Well said. And in college campuses, they can actually have, groups, Christian groups,
Yes.
things of that nature.
And that should be allowed in high schools, and
Yeah, but is
groups
it
like
is that allowed in high schools and middle schools?
Now they are now. So if there's a prayer club, for example, if at a public school, if a student group wants to have a prayer club, and or a Bible study, or even some sort of devotional club, look, if you have the ultimate frisbee team or other, the robotics club or whatever have you, by all means you should be able to have the Bible club or the prayer club.
Are they allowed to have it though?
Constitutionally, yes, now they are. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Thank you
Well, this has
so
been a
much.
great show. Thank you so much, Professor Muñoz. We're just so honored to have you with us today. And we thank our audience for all your great questions. And next week, Tuesday, May 27th, it's the day after Memorial Day, so we are not going to be having a chat that day. So we will be back with you all on Tuesday, June 3rd. So be sure and join us. Have a great Memorial Day weekend, and as we honor the fallen in our country. And so thank you again to our audience, and thank you so much, Professor Muñoz.
Thank you. A real pleasure.